But my grandmother taught these domestics and others Robert's Rules of Order. And boy, did they conduct the meetings and with aplomb. It would be appropriate just to look here at this incredible lineage. This is part of the family tree. And you're all from Brigham Young Law School, correct? And it's so fascinating because you should know that George Romney, who was the governor of Michigan and was a good friend of mine, I met him. He was the governor of Michigan who did a lot of forward things in Michigan. And more importantly, then Richard Nixon appointed him the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. He appointed the first African American as the Deputy Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, a gentleman by the name of Sam Jackson, who was a vice president of the National NAACP and was from Kansas. I mention that because the threads of history tend to weave their way through things, and it's important that faiths come together and that people not rely upon what they read so much as what the acts of people are. My grandmother did common cause with the Quakers here in Maryland, and they were part of the merchant class, but they also believed in the freedom of the human being and that they abhorred slavery. And so that one line of the family, my middle name is Bowen, B-O-W-E-N, and it's really Swahili. They changed it to the Welsh Bowen, B-O-W-E-N, when this African came from Ethiopia. And in Swahili, there's a B-O-W, and in French, there's an accented girl over the E, and that's Swahili for what my name is, and in fact, I've traced my family back there. But part of it, she says, we must tell the story. She says, that's why we're all of the colors of the rainbow. And this started when I had a conversation with her as to why, during the days Stokely Carmichael came here, others in the movement of the sit-ins, Dr. King, why I couldn't get an afro. Because I had curly hair. She said, let me tell you who my great-grandfather was. And this is Lily Carroll Jackson right at the top. Her great-grandfather was Charles Carroll of Carrollton, Maryland's signer of the Declaration of Independence. Her father had blonde hair and blue eyes, and her mother was by complexion. So her point was just to show where we were all from, but then what she was most proud of, there is a daguerreotype from 1842 of her great-grandfather, who was the son of an African, who came to Maryland in 1785. And he had come from England. The British, of course, had, if you had gold or something, they let you go no matter what your color was. They were all virgins. But anyway, he came to Maryland and landed in Annapolis. And he went to Montgomery County, which he passed through coming here to Baltimore. And there was a place called Ashton, A-S-H-T-O-N, a kind of an oasis in the middle of a slave state, Maryland, where the Quaker families there abhorred slavery and prohibited and allowed Africans to buy land. And so Lily Jackson's great-grandfather was named Cyrus. And you know who helped discover the records? The Mormon Church, as I went to Utah to do the research and got the best records ever. And so this is a product of the records from the Mormon Church they had on the Bowen, and because everybody else couldn't find it. And this matched up perfectly with my grandmother's oral history. What she was a dynamo. And the point was that you see all of this family, this African, the father of this Bowen, when he came to America, he was able to buy land, and I have the deeds where he, in 1801, purchased almost 80 acres of land in Montgomery County, and he purchased it in shillings. So you know he came from England when he did that. And more importantly, they told him that and he wanted sons to work the land. But they said that if he married an African woman, the chances were your children might become slaves. Now this is 1800. So he then married, he purchased the indentured contract of a white English woman, and then a Dutch woman, and then finally a French woman. But collectively he had 43 children. And so he's quite a prolific character. And but he only had 3 sons. So out of all that effort, and finally the Quakers told him he couldn't marry anyone because the last marriage he was 64 and had 10 children by the French wife who had been a servant, you know, an indentured servant, and was earning her freedom. And sure enough, in the census data, there it is this Cyrus Bowen. Now Charles Carleton was the son of the Declaration of Independence, and I always wondered why this man who could be Lily Mae Carroll Jackson's great-grandfather, why he would write the words that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and yet he was the largest slaveholder in the colonies. And he himself had escaped Ireland because he was a Catholic, and for religious purposes. And he came, but yet he was a widow and was the longest living of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. So he was having children well into his 80s, but so everyone has a role to play. So I didn't get my afro, but I understood why now. They get it. But all of her children, and my grandfather was the product of the Native Americans in Mississippi, and he was very fair. You'll see photographs of him. And she often said, my husband was too white to be colored, and I'm too colored to be white, but we're husband and wife, and some children look like mama, some look like papa. But the idea is that we are amalgamum in America, and that we go back enough, we all are really related. If you go back to Lucy's bones, you'll see. It's important in this room. One day I was a student, and I think we should start the movie because giving you a time frame. But it's important to know that this is the place where Thurgood Marshall came. And I would walk in, and there would be, my grandmother had that Quaker spirit of utilitarianism and not, get material items. Like she taught us, she says, I said, well, Grandma, how am I going to sew this up? She said, you have a hole in your sock. You ought to get a needle and thread. I said, well, how am I going to do that? Can I get my cousin, who was a young woman? She said, no, boy, you learned how to sew too. So she told home. I had three brothers, there were 4 of us, so all of us had to sew, and all the things that we normally reserve when we thought, because the culture said that women would sew. She said, no, you were going to sew. And I said, well, some of the other kinds of things. So we learned how to scrub floors, and we were to come and dust and wash windows and do whatever was necessary. And we learned as well that women were just as equal, if not more so, than men. And it was important for boys growing up in the 50s to understand that. So my grandmother kind of liberated us. But she was only 5'1" or 5'2", but she was a beautiful woman. You can see she had a size 19 waist. Look at this dress. This is a replica of her original dress. The original dress is very fragile, but she had it made, and she finished the teaching school. These are her certificates. It's just remarkable that she preserved all of this. And that's on the rear wall is her holding her diploma, her teaching diploma. Before she had an option, she went to the famous Johns Hopkins Hospital, and there was a Dr. Crowe, C-R-O-W-E, who was there experimenting, and she had an earache. And she went into Hopkins, and because of the color of her skin, she couldn't be operated on in the main facility. And Dr. Crowe just assumed she was a person walking in off of the streets. And he had a team of young physicians, and they experimented on her. And what they did is they made a mistake and cut, Dr. Crowe did, the main mastoid nerve of her face, which caused the whole face to shift. And then she, for the rest of her life, had a 1-inch metal plate in her skull from his incision. And in fact, when she awakened from surgery, Dr. Crowe, she said, came to her and said, Lily, how did you make it through this? She said, I prayed to God, and God got me through. I said, God, I'll give you a life of service if you let me live to raise my 2 children. She only had 2 daughters then. And so she then began to teach herself how to speak again, to play the piano. My grandfather was a religious motion picture in the days of silent movies. So they would do all sorts of biblical characters, Blind Bartimaeus, the story of that, and my grandmother would sing and play the piano. My grandfather would roll it, and in fact they had so much trouble in World War I because he and my grandfather looked white, and he had this woman who was brown, my complexion, traveling in Mississippian places. They almost got lynched by the Klan on a couple of occasions. But my grandmother would carry their marriage certificate, and it would further enrage the local sheriffs that this white man would be going around with this woman, and she said, well, that's my husband, and that further enraged the local sheriffs. But the idea is that they traveled on the road. But she came from a mother named Amanda Bowen, who married Carol, and she descends of the Bowen line, this African line. And in fact, we have now, through DNA, the wonders of DNA, but fortunately the Mormon Church helped me track down my relatives in Liberia, because and several of my family members in Liberia graduated from the Mormon school established there. It's a small world. But it's significant because after, remember this, John Bowen had this many children, and he knew that America was changing, and we had not settled the Georgia and the Carolinas, and they needed slaves to do that, and they didn't want Africans who were free walking around. So the Maryland Missionary Society began to send free Africans. First they tried Haiti, they tried a number of places. They finally settled on Liberia, which was next to Sierra Leone, which was established by the British. The British, in their cavalier way, just said, we'll abolish slavery and send everyone to Sierra Leone, irrespective of what their tribal traditions. And that's why to this day you still have all kinds of problems in Sierra Leone. Well, that to say, Lily Jackson came from that spirit, and she came back to Baltimore. And ladies, you are the son. She told me that in 1922 she came back. She says this was either feast or famine on the road. She said she was a great piano player, but she wanted her children to get a great education, and they wouldn't get it on the road. And she came back, and her mother taught her business skills. My grandmother taught me algebra, and said, "This is going to be the key to your future work. Come here." And each of my brothers she taught, and the others who stayed here. And sure enough, it's been the way to do it. And then she also uses it to try to remember things. She said, if you repeat it 5 times, you'll have it for life. And these were the kinds of things that just endeared her to not only the family, but the community. She would stop and assist. She believed in the children. You know, whenever she went out to preach, she wouldn't spend as much time with adults as she would with the children. She says, you know, she said, when I meet my maker, I think St. Peter's going to say, what did you do for the children? Is the first question he asked of you. So that we've got to do something to kind of prick their collective consciences, to inspire them so that we never give up on a child. And she did that in a way that was so unusual. Now you can, if we can get this screen down.
Okay.
Iris?